Welcome to this video on Cuba for section 6 of the International Relations. That's paper 1. Now, Cuba will be thinking of the missile crisis obviously, but there's a bit more to it than that you need to know. So we're going to start with the Cuban Revolution. There have been questions on this in the past that have nothing to do with the Soviet Union, so you do need to know the Cuban Revolution as a separate event. Fidel Castro, the chap you can see just behind that box there, he's the chap that leads the Cuban Revolution. He wants to overthrow the pro-American government that's led by a man called Batista. He wants to stop a flow of Cuban money to the US. The reason that's happening, it's American businessmen that own a lot of the businesses and a lot of the property in Cuba. And it's the Cuban people who are the ones that are living in poverty. Castro wants to put an end to all of that. So his successful revolution, where he kicks out Batista, results in him reclaiming American-owned land and giving it to Cubans. Please remember, he is not a communist. The Americans certainly paint him as one. He's certainly a socialist. He is not a communist. He is not working with the Soviet Union at this point in time in 1959. The American response to this is underwhelming, shall we say. They start off by banning sugar imports from Cuba. This is a massive problem with Cuba. Cuba's economy relies on sugar exports, and America is its largest market. So, not missing a trick, Khrushchev leaps on that. He volunteers to buy Cuba's sugar. Very clever move. Brings Cuba closer to the USSR, makes the USA look a little bit silly, and ultimately means that that sanction has very little impact on Cuba. So the Americans go a little bit more direct. Numerous assassination attempts on Castro. The Americans cannot stand having this socialist that has reclaimed their land on their doorstep. Assassination attempts include exploding cigars and various other James Bond style assassinations which abysmally fail. So they go for a more direct approach again. Assassination didn't work, stopping trade didn't work, let's try invading. They don't go so far as to send the American army, so what they have is the CIA sending in Cuban exiles. Now, Eisenhower and the CIA are firmly of the belief that this Fidel Castro must be desperately unpopular, and at the first sign of any attempt to get rid of him, they will all magically rise up and kick him out. This doesn't happen whatsoever. April 1961, the Cuban exiles land. They leave from Guatemala. They're supported by the American Air Force. They're armed by the CIA. It's absolutely ridiculous. There is no popular uprising. The American Air Force has not done its job. The Cuban Air Force is still functional. Castro knows all about it, and they get trapped in the Bay of Pigs where they attempted to land. Their ships get destroyed along with all their supplies, stranding them on the islands, and they all get taken prisoner, about 1,500 of them. It's an absolute disaster. One of the biggest disasters you can possibly imagine. In fact, nothing goes right for them at all. It's a PR and propaganda disaster for the Americans. The Cuban reaction to that is, quite understandably, Castro realises he needs a bit of protection here. The US clearly doesn't like him. It's much bigger than him. It's got a much stronger army than him. It's already tried it's tried several times to kill him. It's now tried to invade him. The USSR is a natural ally if you're looking to defend yourself against the Americans. Khrushchev is more than happy to help out the Cubans. This is the perfect opportunity for him to get missiles in range of the mainland US without having to develop expensive intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. The Americans already have the ability to hit Russia, you must remember. There are missiles in Turkey, they have allies across Europe, they have B-52s that can drop a nuke pretty much anywhere. The Russians don't have the ability to strike back the US. Cuba offers them that opportunity. They are happy to help. So on the 25th of September, 114 Soviet ships equipped with everything you need to set up your own nuclear warhead site set off for Cuba. They've got the missiles, they've got the launch pads, they've got everything. So this map illustrates to you why Cuba is such a problem. You can see that Only Seattle is going to get away with it. The rest of the US is fair game for any nuke stationed in Cuba. The various rings are the various ranges of Soviet missiles that are being put on the islands. So, this becomes known as the 13 Days Crisis. Wonderful film with Kevin Costner. I suggest you watch it if you have the time in your revision. So 16th of October is when Kennedy finds out about the plans that missiles are on their way to Cuba. The boat takes a long time from Russia, so don't be confused by the date. 16th of October then. That's when the 13 days really begins. The Hawks and the Doves. Now that might confuse you. Why are we talking about birds? The Hawks is the name given to Kennedy's generals that thought we need a first strike option, we need to overthrow Cuba, we need to bomb the missile sites, we need to sink the ships. Anything that's aggressive, they are the Hawks. It is mostly the chiefs of staff. The Doves, they're the people that are very, very cautious about any sort of military intervention. They don't want to provoke any sort of war. Tensions are fairly high. The Berlin Wall was a bit of a disaster. USA and USSR are not getting on. This is not a period of cooperation whatsoever. So the camp is split. Do we do something drastic, or do we try and do something a little bit more peaceful? An almost happy medium is reached 20th of October. The blockade is almost a compromise between the two camps from Kennedy. It will stop the missiles getting to Cuba. It won't provoke a war. And by the 28th of October, both sides have agreed that this needs to come to an end. Those 8 days in between are obviously not that simple. You do need to look into those in more detail. A quick rundown: these ships get closer and closer to the blockades, tensions get higher and higher, letters are exchanged, you do need to know the order and contents of what happens, and there is an American spy plane shot down over Cuba. You do need details on the 13 days, it is a conceivable question, but we don't have the time for it in this video. So, the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis is Khrushchev has to publicly back down. That's part of the agreement. The ships turn around and they go back to Russia. Secondly, Kennedy secretly withdraws his missiles from Turkey. So in terms of missile withdrawal, it's kind of tit for tat. No missiles in Cuba, no missiles in Turkey. The difference is Khrushchev has to publicly be doing this, Kennedy gets to do it in private. The hotline, a telephone line that directly connects Moscow to Washington. No more sending of cumbersome letters through the embassies. They can speak together, man to man, very, very quickly, in the hope that they can diffuse any situation like this from happening again. You must remember the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest that we ever came to World War III. The Limited Test Ban Treaty 1963 is not a huge step in getting rid of nuclear weapons, but it is a sign they're willing to talk about this sort of thing, and hence it is highly significant. It's the beginning of a process of détente, the idea that we can get on with each other. This is the long-term aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There will be the odd crisis after this, but effectively détente begins in 1963. It is a healing of relations, if you like. They're not friends, don't ever think they're friends, but they're certainly not quite as savage enemies. By 1965, the Soviets further make it less likely that there's going to be a war by drawing level in the arms race. By that I mean they have the same number of missiles pretty much as the Americans and a similar nuclear capability. This leads to the idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. Any war that happens is going to result in the annihilation of mankind, which is a pretty good reason to not go to war if it's all possible. And finally, the French get the hump and disappear. I'm not sure how likely it is that that will come up on the exam paper, but do note it's an interesting detail. The French basically realise if a nuclear war kicks off, we're sat right in the middle of it, and we're not too happy with that. The Americans could drag us into war, so they get out of NATO and set up their own nuclear programme from 1966 onwards. That is, in a nutshell, the Cuban Revolution, Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do not consider that sufficient for your exam. Thank you for watching.